question about this that sometimes arises after you look at 1 Corinthians 12. And it is, what is the deal with greater gifts? Now, last week I introduced this and talked about the first of two issues. Today we're going to look at the second of the same two issues. It all is based on the fact that we have just read at this point 1 Corinthians 12, 21 through 26. And I won't read the whole passage this week. We looked at it last week. But the point of the whole passage is that God has arranged the gifts in the body and done other things within the body in such a way with the intention of creating in us a situation where we're all important, where we all are valuable. Notice this part right here. God has so composed the body, giving more abundant honor to that member which lacked, so that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. It says God gave more abundant honor to anybody who lacked it. He wanted to make sure nobody was lacking in honor, that no member of the body felt without honor. So no matter what your gift is, you should feel honor from one another and from God. And what it's saying is God has arranged the body, including giving us the gifts he did, distributed the gifts he did to us in order to accomplish that. So God has given us different gifts, not to make us think that we're less important, but to help us recognize that each one of us is important. My gift is unique, and it's important to the church. Your gift is unique, and it's important in the church. He has given us the honor we might otherwise have lacked, so that we can all have the same care for one another, that there be no division. The division here he's talking about is the division between the elites and the non-elites within the church, between like the super spiritual ones and the non-super spiritual ones. And he's saying that kind of division shouldn't happen. We should all care for one another equally. We should all value one another equally. We should all grant one another honor equally. Romans 12 says, outdo one another in showing honor. And so that's the idea here. So it would seem from that all gifts are sort of equal. And yet, in the next two verses, he says, God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then all these other things. So that was the first question. How can there be these ranked gifts if we're all supposed to have honor and equal honor, so to speak, so that there's no division, so that there's no separating in this sense? And the answer I said last week and argued for, and hopefully you agree with me, but if not, figure it out for yourself, was that this is not talking about the importance or the value of the gifts here. It's talking about the fact that they are part of the hierarchy, the rankings of authority within the church, that apostles, prophets, and teachers are leadership gifts, and they're the ones who are in charge. And he was mainly making this point just to point out that miracles and gifts of healings are not the ones in charge. And so it's still all about seeing the importance of every different gift. Now, at the very end, though, he adds another thing. He says, that's what we did last week. At the very end, he says, earnestly desire the greater gifts. And that's this week. And that's kind of strange because, again, how can there be greater gifts if we're all supposed to have honor for the gifts we have in the way God has made us? And at first, when I used to read this, I used to wonder if the greater gifts meant the first apostles, second prophets, third teachers. But I don't think that's what it means. I think greater gifts here has a very different meaning, and I'm going to show you that in a few minutes. But let me start by saying something quick about it. And that is, notice the difference between short-term and long-term gifts. Remember that all the way up until now in 1 Corinthians 12, the focus has been on short-term gifts, on spiritual manifestations. The fact that I might get a word of knowledge or a prophecy, a word of prophecy, or a discernment, distinguishing of spirits, or whatever else, a word of wisdom, whatever else. But when he gets to the first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, he switches to the language of Ephesians 4. He switches to talking about the people and the offices and the positions. And those things are not short-term. Paul did not come every week and ask again for the gift of apostleship. Paul was an apostle because he was appointed that way. This is looking long-term. But when we get to earnestly desire the greater gifts, I'll show you this in the next chapter or two, he talks about praying for a gift. And he doesn't mean praying that you would become the official prophet with authority over the rest of the church. What he means is praying for a word from God, just a specific short-term gift. So that's part of the reason I think these are talking about different things. The first one's talking about the roles, about the long-term offices. The second one is talking about short-term gifts again. But let me show you what it's saying about them. We're going to travel through this chapter, quickly over 13, and then into chapter 14 to see what the point is. He starts by saying, earnestly desire the greater gifts. And then at the very end of the chapter, he says, and I show you a still more excellent way. And he heads into 1 Corinthians 13, which is all about love, and saying that The gift doesn't matter if you don't use it in love. What matters about your gift, what's really honorable and valuable and important in your gift, is that you love others using it. And you pass it off to give it to others as part of your love. So the point here is love. Now, having said that, in chapter 14, he returns to his initial point. Earnestly desire the gifts, yet love's really important. Pursue love, yet desire earnestly spiritual gifts. And he goes on to talk more about that. So he first says the most important thing is love, but then he says, I want to return to the point I was making, which is that you should desire earnestly spiritual manifestations. And not just, he says, it's fine that you guys really want to see the Holy Spirit at work in you. It's fine that you really want to see him working supernaturally through you. That's not wrong. But it's important that you desire the greater gifts, the ones that you should be aiming at. And he specifically says here, especially that you may prophesy. Now, if we just stopped here, you would assume that what he means is that prophecy is the super gift. It's the gift you should always pursue. And that's not exactly true. What we need to do is go on and see why he says this. And what he's going to do in the next 5 verses is compare and contrast 2 different gifts that the Corinthians were fixated on. At least one of them they were. Tongues and prophecy. Now, today, some people don't think either tongues or prophecy are around, but it doesn't matter. In Corinth, they were still around. So to parse this passage, to understand this passage, we need to remember that they were around for Corinth. And the Corinthians had the gift of tongues, they had gifts of prophecy, and they were far more impressed by tongues. Because anybody could stand up and claim to be prophesying, and didn't need to be supernatural to claim that. But to speak in tongues for them really demonstrated the work of the Spirit. So they were putting a priority on tongues, which was higher than that of prophecy. And Paul says you've got it backwards. It's prophecy that you should be focusing on, not tongues. And the important thing is why. So let's go on and look and see why Paul prefers prophecy to tongues here. He says, for one who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God. For no one understands, but in his spirit he speaks mysteries. But one who prophesies speaks to men for edification and exhortation and consolation. One who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but one who prophesies edifies the church. What he's saying is, when you're in a church meeting, and when the whole point is that you're getting together and encouraging one another, make sure you use the gift that will encourage one another. If you're using tongues, it's fine for you, but it's not going to help anybody else. If you're using prophecy, it will help somebody else. Speak to me to build me up, to console me, to exhort me. Don't speak to me in something I can't even understand. And I'll do the same for you. So he's not saying that there's never a place for tongues. He's saying that if you have a choice, if you're around other people and they're listening to hear what you have to say, tell them something they can understand. Use a gift that will do them some good. Now, I wish he says that you all spoke in tongues. He's saying tongues is fine. I have nothing against tongues. I'm all for tongues. But even more, that you'd prophesy. I'm not saying tongues is bad. I'm just saying, he says, but prophesying is even better in the context of the church meeting, because greater is one who prophesies the one who speaks in tongues, unless he interprets, so that the church may receive edifying. And the key idea here is to notice what the reason given is. It's so that the church may receive edifying. That's the reason. Now, I want to keep going and show you a little bit more about this. I'm going to start by repeating the same verse. Greater is one who prophesies than one who speaks in tongues, unless he interprets, so that the church may receive edifying. And I want to point out the unless he interprets. That's really interesting, because he just said prophesying is greater than tongues, but now he says unless the person speaking tongues interprets. And then it's not greater anymore. Why? Because now the tongues is understandable. And what that shows you is he's not saying that prophecy is somehow inherently better than tongues. If he did, he wouldn't put the unless he interprets in there. He's saying that prophecy by itself is only better than tongues because it's understandable. And if you interpret the tongues, now they're the same again. And in the same next verse, you see again that he doesn't mean that prophecy is like this super spiritual gift above everything else. He says, now, brethren, if I come to you speaking in tongues, what will I profit you? Because you don't understand it. Unless I speak to you either by way of revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching. And along with prophecy, he mentions 3 other terms, all of which have the same idea. They're understandable. So when he says prophecy, he doesn't just mean prophecy here. He means anything that's understandable. He means whatever can be understood and will edify is greater than the thing that will not edify. Later on in verse 12 and 13, he says, since you're zealous of spiritual gifts, he says, since you're so interested in these spiritual manifestations, you're so interested in pursuing anything the Holy Spirit can do through you supernaturally, that's fine. But direct that focus towards edifying each other. Seek to abound for the edification of the church. Go ahead and pursue those spiritual experiences in every way you can, but do it in a way that will edify one another. Therefore, let one who speaks in a tongue pray that he may interpret. That's the way you pursue edification. I just want to point out that, again, first of all, interpreting tongues is considered for him just as good as the prophecy or the revelation or knowledge or teaching because it's understandable. And secondly, he's been saying, seek to abound, earnestly desire. Now you see what form that takes in practice. It means you pray for it. And this is a short-term prayer. I'm sitting here in the moment. I want to speak in tongues, but I want to edify somebody else. I pray, God, would you give me an interpretation so that it can be helpful for other people? And that's what he's telling them to do. And at the end of verse 26, he says, what's the outcome then, brethren? When you assemble, each one has a psalm, a teaching, a revelation, a tongue, and interpretation. You have these different things. You have to think about what will edify. And so if it's a tongue, you need an interpretation. But a psalm or a teaching or revelation or prophecy or anything else like that would also be okay, as long as it's understandable. Let all things be done for edification. So that's his point. Now, again, this is applicable even if you think tongues and prophecy are no longer around, because the basic principle, what will edify, still applies if with the gifts that you think are around today. So regardless, that's the question. Use the gift that will edify. So this is talk about short-term gifts, and the passage contrasts using prophecy and tongues in the church meeting. And it concludes that prophecy is greater because it edifies others. And so that means when other gifts edify, they could be considered greater gifts as well. He mentions interpreting. He mentions revelation, knowledge, and teaching. He mentions has a psalm. There's a lot of different things that he mentions. The point is, if it edifies, it can be considered a greater gift as well. And that explains, by the way, why he spent time talking about 1 Corinthians 13 first. He had to establish that it's love, that it's edifying, that it's helping others out, that it's being good to them, which makes your gifts worth what they're supposed to be worth. Remember, without love, you're just a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. So all gifts are equally important, but only used in love, only used to edify. So you can see that the greater gifts are the ones that edify. That's what it means. Greater gifts are the ones that meet the need of the moment. And then finally, when he talks about earnestly desire spiritual gifts, you can see that it means to pray for it. And I think also he means to value it when it occurs, either in yourself or others. The Corinthians were not valuing certain gifts. They were valuing the supernatural looking ones, the healing and the miracles, but they weren't valuing prophecy as much as they should, and they weren't even valuing at all things like serving or mercy or giving or administration. Those things would also be greater gifts in any context in which they are appropriate, in any context in which they would edify. And that's the point he's trying to say. Measure the importance of the spiritual gift by, is it edifying? Is it helping others? And that's what you focus on, because that's the purpose. So, and again, these verses are applicable whether or not prophecy is around today. So the final comments from both last week and this week. It is true that God has composed the body and he's given us our different gifts and given us diverse gifts so that we would realize that every one of us is important and every one of our gifts are valuable. And the equipping gifts from last week are numbered not to reflect their importance or to make people elite who have those, but to reflect hierarchy and authority. And equipping gifts are given actually to help the rest of us develop our own gifts. And this week, a greater gift here means not that one person has a better gift in general than another person, but that the gift that's greater is the one that meets the needs of the moment best. So I go through life asking for the need of the moment to be met through me. I go through life asking, this person needs mercy, would you give me mercy? This person needs evangelism, would you give me evangelism? This person needs a word of knowledge, would you give me a word of knowledge? And I focus on what is needed, and that's what the greater gift is. That's what I'm supposed to earnestly desire. Neither one of these, if you think about it right, undercuts the value and the importance of every gift. Neither one of these means that your gift somehow isn't important because it's not as flashy as somebody else's, or because it's not leadership like somebody else's, or because it's not speaking out like somebody else's. Is it edifying people? Are you using it to love others? Then it is a greater gift in the right sense, in the sense in which Paul meant. And that's what's going on here. Okay, see you next time.